We're going to be talking about shaping tomorrow's landscape now, and who are the innovators and disruptors in the UK real estate market are going to be. I'm joined by Olaide Oboh, Executive Director from Socius, and Lucy Stainton, Commercial Director of the local data company. Thanks, guys, for being here with us today. Let's go straight in. Lucy, who would you say has come onto the retail scene in the last year and shaken things up a little bit?
I mean, I think we've seen some really interesting kind of things in sort of the pop-up and brand activation space, which I think is really exciting. So the likes of, for example, Lone Design Club, Souk, the work that Someday Studios are doing with Westminster Council. And I think what's really interesting about those guys is kind of how it changes the sort of dynamism in terms of that retail space. So alongside those like key anchors, being able to not only just bring kind of independent D2C brands into that space, but also changing them up as well. So I think that keeps that real estate, really dynamic. And it also means that, independent brands have the opportunity to kind of showcase themselves in a physical setting as well, which I think is really important for brand building.
Yeah, absolutely. Olaide?
I'm going to go for a traditional brand that has just boosted up the way they work. So Nike.
Mm-hmm.
So Nike always used to be a brand where you can buy anywhere. You can buy it at Sports Direct, you can buy it in John Lewis, you can buy it in your local shop. Actually, Nike decided to take all that away and actually focus on their own physical presence. So using their own outlets as their main B2C offer. And alongside the retail element, they've created a lot more lifestyle offering. So you have the Run Club. You can go in and have events and experiences in the store. And I think really owning their own brand and their B2C profile for me has been really interesting.
Excellent, okay. And what are the advantages, do you think, of doing things differently, like Nike's done, using your example?
I think it's about having that direct relationship with your customer, aligning your values with your customer, creating much more personalized experiences for them, and blending that kind of digital and physical world as well. I see a lot of brands who have really understood what the digital means, and how do you create a physical kind of, not a replication, but how do you then enhance that in a physical space. You see, brands are launching things online now. They're launching on social media. There isn't this kind of desire to have this massive fanfare in a physical space, because actually they know that their customers are digital, and creating that digital footprint, but actually enhancing that physically, for me, is a really interesting approach.
Lucy, what do you think the advantages are of doing things slightly differently?
Well, I think for me, if I can speak to some of the work that we've been doing in the sort of post-pandemic setting, we've seen a lot of brands who, for example, might have historically been very much focused in high streets, looking at, for example, taking space on retail parks and kind of changing up their format. Or, for example, brands that have typically been very city centre focused, thinking about more suburban locations. And I think that for us has been really interesting in terms of kind of brands who have been watching how the consumer has changed their sort of behaviours, and then actually being able to put stores and formats in front of them that kind of meet maybe a different sort of shopper requirement, or just a different shopper mission. So I think really for me the advantage of doing things differently has been all around that kind of changing your sort of portfolio strategy to meet that kind of changing post-pandemic consumer.
What trends which were once niche do you now see in the wider industry?
Do you know what? I mean, again, I'm going to have to speak to kind of our world and what we focus on, but I think certainly the use of data.
Yeah.
We've seen a huge increase in terms of people's appetite to use data and technology to underpin their strategy. And, typically before the pandemic, there was still a lot of kind of gut feel involved in terms of, how you shaped your brand and what your store strategy looked like. And that absolutely still has a place. Of course it does. And it was oftentimes, I think, maybe the larger operators who were maybe more data hungry. Mm-hmm. But we've seen such a shift in terms of the types of projects we're working on with the types of brands. Maybe they're slightly more in their infancy, but they're coming at it off the bat really wanting to embed kind of data within their strategy. So I think that for me is probably the biggest shift that we've seen.
Can you add anything to that?
I don't disagree at all. I think data is king, and actually understanding your customers and actually people who aren't coming to you is so important now. And actually really hyper-local data is so powerful now, and it's determining where you spend your advertising, where you locate your stores, and actually where you focus maybe your experiential experiences on. So data is really powerful. The other thing we're seeing is actually that that lifestyle element of the brand.
Yeah.
Brands actually stepping out of their zone. They're not just focusing on what they're selling. They're creating, they're stepping into ESG. They're stepping into, humanitarian elements. Understanding that that's really important for their customer and aligning themselves with that. So we're seeing brands become more comfortable with that approach.
Can you name any brands who are doing that?
You've got some brands who already do it well and they are very well established. You've got Patagonia who know it well and they do it well. But actually you're seeing smaller niche brands who are saying, actually, this is really important for our customer. And if it's important for our customer, it's got to be important for us. And we've got to make sure that we are practicing what we preach and we're responding to what our customers want and need.
Yeah. We've heard a lot about AI recently. Are there any obvious or not so obvious applications in retail leisure property?
Look, AI is an interesting one because I think we're all still figuring it out. Well, there's a certain generation that's figuring out, but I know we see a lot of people who are becoming very comfortable with it because actually it's just democratizing how we do our work. I think certainly from a retail environment, I think what people come to a retail environment is for that. It's for the depth of understanding. It's for the service. It's for the connection. And I think that as much as AI can help us, it can't take all the good things away. I think AI has a massive role to play digitally. It increases the customer experience. It immediately helps customers find things, and it personalizes the experience for the customer as well. So I think it has a great role to play digitally. I'm still yet to see the physical environment because I think we all look for something else in a physical space.
What's LDC's take on this, Lucy?
I don't have a huge amount to add, to be honest. It's not really an area that we get involved in, but I think exactly as you've just said, people are still very much figuring it out, and I think there's a lot of kind of talk at the moment. It's clearly a hot topic, but I haven't seen any kind of real tangible examples yet of how it's being used in property.
Okay. Olaide, I'd like to address this question to you, if I may. What kind of schemes offer the best returns for you, and how important is retail and leisure in the mix generally?
Retail and leisure is a significant important. We talk about actually if you concentrate on a retail and leisure, you add more to your rents, whether it's commercial or residential. And the reason why is because that's how people interact with spaces. We don't all walk around a space looking up. We might love a building or love the space, but actually the ground floor experience is key, and curating that is really important. So we spend a lot of time on the ground floor. And that's data-driven, understanding who do we think the customers are going to be, what does a local area look like, what does a local area need, how do we complement without competing, how do we make sure we're creating destination, a place that people can come to and dwell. So it's a massive focus for us because what we know is if we get that right, it attracts customers, it creates we made it attracting the occupiers as well, and we're adding, effectively we'll make the money in the rents in the commercial or the residential.
Yeah, absolutely. Lucy, I'd like to ask you what positive trends are showing in out-of-town retail data at the moment?
Yeah, well, we just released our latest report, and actually that was a real kind of key focus in terms of looking at the relative strength and trajectory of high streets versus shopping centres versus retail parks. And I think what was really interesting that came out of that analysis was this idea of we know, for example, that during the pandemic, retail parks were a really winning format, and that was for a number of different reasons. You could drive to those locations, you didn't have to get public transport, larger format units, that was really well conducive to things like social distancing, so those stores got greater throughput. And during the pandemic, we did see voids on retail parks increase slightly, but that was more to do with some restructuring that was happening in the homeware space. What we've seen happen since is that a lot of different occupiers and brands are really getting across that trend and opening in retail parks where perhaps they haven't actually had retail park space before. And subsequently, those locations are becoming much more diverse, so therefore they're much more attractive to the consumer. And actually, vacancy on retail parks is coming down and down again. So it's 8.1% now compared to, say, shopping centres on average, which is 17.8%.
Right.
So you can really see the difference. Yeah. I think the out-of-town piece has been a really interesting trend to follow, and it's definitely still on a very kind of positive trajectory.
Well, that's good news, isn't it? I'd like to know, what are your predictions that will impact retail and leisure property for 2024?
Again, I think one of the biggest things that we've seen actually in kind of our latest analysis has been this idea of repurposing and redevelopment. So we know that there's kind of a rising sort of vacancy profile across UK real estate. We know that's been a trend for a while. We also know that the length of time that those units remain vacant are longer and longer. And so what we've seen that's, I think, been really positive over kind of the last 6 and 12 months has been a lot of like redevelopment of that space, so conversion of retail and leisure real estate into things like residential, community space, office space, mixed use schemes. And that's a really important thing, not just to mitigate kind of rising long-term vacancy, but also to meet the needs of the local catchment and the local consumers, to create more diverse spaces, more attractive spaces. So I think we'll see that continue as we go into 2024 and beyond, that idea of redevelopment.
I think we're going to see much more localization of retail. I think what we're seeing the kind of the desire to have a local offer, and I think COVID really exacerbated that, where we were all going to our high streets, buying from our local greengrocers, and I think with the rise of hybrid working as well, you are seeing people demanding more from their local high streets, and now the data is supporting that, because the data is showing that there's a higher spend, there's a different kind of demographic on a high street. Not everyone's going to the nearest city, or leaving the city for 8 hours a day. They're actually in the town. So I think we're going to see much more localized offer, much more, and we're going to see high street start to look different. I completely agree. We are seeing a diversification of the high street as well. It's not just about retail. No. We've got to change those uses so that we have with resilience on the high street. So whether it is residential, commercial, community, retail, alongside those kind of uses that make the high street more sustainable for the long term.
Great stuff. Okay. Will future change require a step change in how we all perceive retail and leisure markets, or will this evolve and happen almost subconsciously?
That's a good question, yeah. I think one of my frustrations is when the noise around retail is always retail is dead, and once you hear a high, Wilkinson's, went down, and there's a perception that the whole market is dead. Yeah. And you walk to your high street and it's vibrant, it's bustling, it's busy, and you go, it's a false narrative. And I think we've got to rewire our brains that retail isn't dead, and online retail doesn't kill the high street. There's this perception that it does, and actually they serve different purposes. The consumer has a choice whether they want to. I can choose if I buy my makeup at Boots or if I go into Boots and buy it. But having that choice is important. So I think they are both performing different purposes, but I think we just got to rewrite that narrative. The high street isn't dead. The high street is evolving, because it has to evolve, because the customer's changing. Post-pandemic, there are different needs and requirements for the high street. So it's just an evolution that's happening, and we've just got to make sure that we are supporting that evolution rather than seeing it as, oh, it's bad, oh, it's not working anymore. It's my view.
I literally couldn't agree with that more, by the way. And I think, and I definitely kind of echo that. And I think, it's something that we struggle with all the time. We produce these statistics, right? So, we're constantly having to kind of dodge that sort of death of the high street narrative, because I don't think it's constructive. And I also don't think it's necessarily true at all. And, we've been producing these stats every 6 months on a continuum, and ultimately everything does naturally evolve. Like, you're absolutely right. And I think, we see it's one of the things that I'm constantly trying to do is sort of, I suppose, point to areas of difference or areas of growth or areas of change, because there is so much happening underneath those top line stats. And I think if we look at things like, there's been an increase in store closures, yeah, that's true. But, following the pandemic, to your point, there was a massive increase in the number of independent businesses that opened. We've seen huge growth in things like health and beauty and food to go and convenience. There's some really robust sectors out there. And we've also seen, since the pandemic, vacancy in shopping centres, for example, is steadily coming down again. We've seen a lot of international entrants coming in, especially in the first 6 months of this year. Sephora, to name one, I think is really exciting. So, yeah, I totally agree with you. I think it's just constantly evolving, and there's a lot that's kind of bubbling underneath the surface, and we need to maybe pay more attention to those kind of early stage growth areas and that newness, rather than focusing kind of on the overarching structural challenges, which are valid. But I think ultimately, the high street, physical retail, it's all here to stay. It's been proven time and time again. So I feel really positively about physical retail.
Well, that was going to be my final question. Ladies, are we positive for 2024? How are we feeling about next year?
I mean, for me personally, yeah, definitely. And I think, the data that we just put out definitely showed kind of an increase in terms of those net closures across the market. Like, the macroeconomic environment this year has been tough. We know that. The number of openings in the first half of this year has held relatively steady, but the number of closures has increased a little bit. However, I think ultimately with things like all of the regeneration and repurposing that we're seeing, again, some of that early stage growth, I still feel really positively about kind of the state that the market's in and the things that are happening and the new brands that we're seeing and consumers returning to cities and to their local high streets. So, yeah, I feel really positively about physical retail, and I think, yeah, the future's looking really good.
Similarly, I feel positive.
You guys are so in sync.
I know, we're aligned. I know. I think we are unfortunately going to see some more closures, but I think that's because brands haven't diversified themselves enough. They've stuck,
for example.
and actually that's just a reality, and we've got to accept that that's going to happen, which will be a shame. But actually, what we are going to see is brands that are much more aligned, that are data driven, that understand their customer, that understand the location, are going to be they're going to be successful. And I think our high streets, as you said, they are here to stay. They're just going to evolve, and we'll see that continuous evolution.
Thank you both very much for your insights today. Thank you.